The call center was a graveyard of forgotten voices. It had been closed for 5 years, a sprawling, 2-story building that had once been the heartbeat of a telemarketing empire. Now, it was a silent monument to a bygone era, its cubicles empty, its phones silent, and its servers dark. I was a freelance videographer, and I was there to shoot a documentary on the building's history. I'd been given the keys by a former employee, a man who had worked there for 30 years, and he had warned me about the place. "The building has a memory," he said. "It holds on to every conversation, every scream, every desperate plea for help. It never lets go." I had laughed at him, but as I walked through the silent, sprawling halls, I started to feel the weight of his words. The air was thick with a profound, bone-deep silence that felt less like an absence of sound and more like a heavy presence. The first strange occurrence was a series of phantom calls. I was in the main server room, a cramped, dusty space in the basement, when I saw it. A single red light flashing on an old switchboard that had been disconnected for years. It flashed once, a solitary, insistent beacon in the dark, and then went out. I chalked it up to a line malfunction, a bug in the old system. But then the calls started to happen more frequently, and I started hearing them. The faint, ghostly sound of an old telephone ringing from somewhere in the empty cubicles. It wasn't a modern ring, but a deep, resonant, bell-like tone that sounded like it was coming from the 1970s. I would search for the source, but it would always stop before I could get close. It was a game of cat and mouse, a chilling little game that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up every time. The calls continued, and they started to get more specific. One night, I was dozing off in my chair when I was jolted awake by the sound of a phone ringing directly outside my office. I shot up, my heart pounding, and flung the door open. The cubicle just outside my office, a dark and dusty space that had been empty for over a year, had a single red light flashing on the old switchboard. The phone was ringing, a loud, clear, insistent sound that was impossible to ignore. I hesitated. For a moment, a cold dread washing over me, and then I picked it up. There was only static on the other end, but then a new sound broke through. A faint, wheezing voice, a whisper so thin and dry it sounded like it was scraping against my eardrum. "Is anyone there?" the voice asked, and I dropped the receiver like a hot coal. The voice had a familiar, unsettling quality to it. It sounded like a recording, a garbled message from an old answering machine. I went through the company's archives, pulling up old records and voicemails. I found a series of tapes from the 1990s, when the office was a bustling hub of activity. As I listened, my blood ran cold. The voice on the tape was the same one I had heard on the phone. It was an old recording, a message from an employee who had worked at the company decades ago, a woman who had passed away years before. The message was a frantic plea for help, a desperate voice saying she was trapped in the building after hours. I listened to the tape over and over again, the terror in her voice, a raw, unvarnished sound that was impossible to mistake. I realized, with a gut-wrenching horror, that the phantom calls weren't just glitches. They were echoes of a past trauma, a plea for help that had been lost in the digital ether. That night, the ringing was everywhere. The office was a symphony of old telephone bells, a relentless cacophony that made it impossible to think. I looked out from my office and saw a faint, pale light moving between the cubicles, a silent, flickering shape that looked like a television screen. It was an old monitor from the 90s, one of the heavy, boxy models, and it was glowing with an unholy blue light. I watched in paralyzed terror as the screen floated from cubicle to cubicle, a ghostly searchlight that was looking for something. The screen moved to the cubicle outside my office, where the phone had rung, and it stopped. The phone rang again, a single, deafening peal that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I felt a profound, chilling sense of presence, as if I was no longer alone in the building. I was an audience to a final, tragic scene. The monitor settled in the cubicle, and a garbled, hissing sound came from the speakers. It was the same voice I had heard on the phone, the old, wheezing plea. But this time, it was different. It wasn't asking for help. It was asking for me. "You're still here," the voice hissed from the speakers, a cold and hollow sound. "You're still alone." I grabbed my bag and ran, not stopping until I was out in the street, the cold night air a welcome slap to my face. I called my supervisor and quit on the spot, unable to articulate the specific horror of what I had seen. The last thing I heard, as I sprinted away from the old office building, was the low, steady hum of the server room, a sound that was now punctuated by the rhythmic, insistent ringing of a single, forgotten phone, a call that would never be answered. The last I looked, the monitor in the cubicle outside my old office was still glowing, its blue light a solitary beacon in the darkness, a monument to a past tragedy that was no longer a story, but a living, breathing horror that was ready to find its next victim. There's an old hospital in my hometown that's been boarded up since the 80s. Everyone calls it the asylum, but it was just a regular hospital that went bankrupt and was left to rot. It's the kind of place local teenagers go to drink and get high, and a rite of passage for us was to spend an entire night in it. My friend, Leo, was turning 21, and for his birthday, he wanted to do it. He'd always been a thrill seeker, and this was his final grand gesture before we all got too old for this kind of foolishness. The three of us, Leo, our friend Chris, and I, packed a backpack with beer, snacks, and a couple of flashlights, and we were off. Getting inside was easy. A loose board on the back wall, and we were in. The air was a blast of cold, stale air, the smell of rot and old medical supplies a physical presence. The darkness was absolute, a heavy, tangible thing that seemed to press in on us from all sides. We set up camp in a long, narrow room on the ground floor, a former ward that had been cleared out. We sat on the dirty floor, sipping our beers, our flashlights creating a small circle of light in the sea of darkness. The night passed slowly, filled with the usual spooky sounds. The creak of the building settling, the scurry of rodents, and the wind rattling the boards on the windows. We were all on edge, but we were also having fun, our fear a shared thrill. As the hours passed, we started to relax, the beer making us bolder. It was just an empty building, a decaying monument to a time long gone. We were wrong. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a sound, but an absence of sound. The wind, which had been a constant companion, suddenly died. The building went completely silent, and then we heard it. A faint, repetitive thumping from the floor above us. It was a single, slow, deliberate beat, like a fist hitting a wall. We all looked up, our faces pale in the flashlight beams. "Just a loose floorboard," Chris whispered, but his voice was thin and shaky. The thumping continued, moving slowly. Down the hall above us, a relentless, rhythmic beat that seemed to be counting down to something. We stayed still, our fear palpable, and as the thumping passed directly over us, a fine layer of dust rained down from the ceiling. A new sound joined the thumping, a faint, wheezing, breathless sound, like someone with a bad lung struggling to breathe. It was right above us. We scrambled out of the room, our flashlights dancing on the walls, our hearts pounding a frantic rhythm. We had to get out of the building. We ran down the hall, and the thumping and the wheezing followed us, a constant, sickening presence that was always just around the corner. We got to the main lobby and the thumping stopped. We paused, gasping for breath, and the silence was more terrifying than the noise. That's when we saw her, standing at the top of the grand staircase. In the cold, sickly green light of the emergency exit sign was a woman. She was wearing a tattered, stained hospital gown, her long, black hair a tangled mess. She was impossibly thin, her limbs long and spidery, and her head was tilted at a grotesque angle. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring down at us, her mouth a single, black hole. She didn't have eyes, just two dark, empty sockets that stared into our souls. The wheezing sound came from her. It was her struggling to breathe, a low, raspy, heartbreaking sound. And then she moved. She didn't walk. She slid down the staircase. A slow, agonizing, bone-breaking slide, her long, spidery limbs scraping on the steps, the sound a horrifying symphony of grinding bone and tearing cloth. We watched, frozen in place, as she slid down, her body a grotesque, inhuman shape, the wheezing sound turning into a long, drawn-out sigh of pain. She was at the bottom of the stairs now, a writhing, broken mass on the floor, her head tilted to the side, and her mouth opened wider, the blackness in her throat seeming to swallow the light. Her whisper filled the room, not with our ears, but with our minds, a single, raspy, desperate plea. Help me. It wasn't a ghost. It was something that had been broken, something that was in a perpetual state of agony. And then she started to pull herself towards us, a long, spidery limb reaching out, her body a writhing, broken mass. We ran. We burst through the back wall, scrambling through the broken boards, not stopping until we were back in the car, speeding away from the hospital. The wheezing sound, the broken sigh of pain, followed us, a chilling echo that still haunts my dreams. We never spoke about it again, but we all know what's in that building. It's not a ghost. It's a memory. It's a broken, tormented thing that is forever trapped in a cycle of suffering, and we were foolish enough to go looking for it. The old orphanage on Elm Street had a reputation that followed it like a shadow. It was a massive brick building, a relic from the early 1900s, with boarded-up windows and a front door that hung precariously on a single hinge. The town had long since forgotten its official name, and everyone just called it the home. My friends and I, being the bored teenagers we were, had heard all the stories, the whispering in the halls, the faint cries of children, the feeling of being watched. We had all promised ourselves we'd go one day, but the fear of it always stopped us. Till one night, when we were all out of dares, and the silence of the night seemed to demand a challenge. We weren't looking for ghosts. We were looking for a story, a memory to hold on to when we were old and gray. We went in at 2 a.m, armed with flashlights and a misplaced sense of courage. The inside of the orphanage was a time capsule of sorrow. The air was cold and smelled of damp, plaster and decay. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a long, winding hallway with faded, peeling wallpaper and a thick layer of dust on the floor. The walls were lined with what must have been dorm rooms, each one with a simple, rusted bed frame. In the corner, as we walked, our flashlights would catch a fleeting glimpse of something, a small, faded drawing on the wall, single, lonely sock on the floor, a tiny, rusted toy car. These small artifacts of a life long gone were more unsettling than any ghost story. They made the place feel not just abandoned, but deeply, profoundly sad. The silence was heavy, a suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb all sound. The first sound we heard was a faint, high-pitched scratching. It was coming from a small vent on the wall, just at the height of a small child. It was a slow, rhythmic sound, like tiny fingernails scraping against metal. We all stopped, our flashlights fixed on the vent. The scratching would stop the moment we looked, and then start again the moment we looked away. One of my friends, a tough girl named Sarah, whispered, "It's just a mouse." But we all knew it wasn't. It had a deliberate, methodical quality to it. The scratching was followed by a new sound, a faint, almost inaudible whispering. It was a child's voice, but it was coming from everywhere at once, a low, buzzing static that was trying to form words. The whispering was accompanied by a strange, humming sound, a low, constant vibration that seemed to fill the entire space. We continued our exploration, the scratching and the humming following us, a constant, sickening presence that was always just around the corner. We got to the old recreation room, a large, open space with a single, massive fireplace and a few scattered chairs. In the center of the room, there was a large, ancient-looking rocking horse. It was painted a faded blue, its wooden eyes chipped and worn. As we walked past it, the rocking horse, which was perfectly still, began to rock. It was a slow, deliberate movement, a rhythmic creaking that echoed in the silence. We all froze, our flashlights fixed on the horse. The creaking grew faster, more frantic, and then a low, wet, smacking sound joined it. It was coming from the rocking horse itself. We watched, horrified, as a dark, viscous liquid began to seep from its eyes, a black, oily substance that dripped onto the floor, staining the dusty wood. The rocking horse was crying. The whispered voices now became a chorus, a frantic cacophony of pleas and wails, and the humming intensified. A high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache. We scrambled out of the room, a primal fear seizing us. We ran down the hallway, our flashlights dancing on the walls, and that's when we saw them. The small, tiny handprints. They were all over the walls, in the same dark, viscous liquid that was dripping from the rocking horse. They were everywhere. 100 tiny hands, all reaching out, all clawing at the walls, their silent, painted cries, a horrifying message. And then we saw him, standing at the end of the hallway, a small, tiny boy, no older than 7, wearing a faded, tattered uniform. His face was pale, his eyes were black, and his mouth was a single, gaping hole. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at us, and from the blackness of his mouth came a single, high-pitched scream, a sound that wasn't a sound, but a feeling of profound, gut-wrenching despair. The scratching and the whispering stopped. The humming intensified, and the little boy began to walk towards us. A slow, deliberate, scraping motion, his tiny feet dragging on the floor. The sound a horrifying symphony of grinding bone and tearing cloth. We didn't wait to see what he would do. We turned and ran, scrambling back through the maze of hallways, our lungs burning, our legs screaming in protest. We burst out of the orphanage, our bodies trembling, our minds a jumble of screaming terror. We ran until we were a mile down the road, and we never looked back. We never spoke of it again, but we all know what's in that building. It's not just a home for forgotten children. It's a tomb, and we had just awakened something that was not meant to be awakened. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is still, I hear it. The faint, high-pitched scratching from deep within a wall. And I know it's not a mouse. It's a reminder. It's waiting.